you're tuning in today that you've received a grant from us. So congratulations, you've made it through the first hurdle. The funding bill was signed by Governor Murphy in December. So from our perspective, you're ready to get started. So you should, as I mentioned, this is a webinar, so you should be able to see who's speaking and the slides on your screen. If you want, you can adjust your how you see your screen on the upper right-hand side. There should be a little tab that says View, and you can adjust if you want to see the speaker side by side or a smaller version of it, or if you want to see the rest of the staff blank screens off to the side. You can use the Q&A at the bottom to put your questions in. We are monitoring that, and we will be answering these questions periodically throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. I think most of you know that the Historic Trust is governed by a citizen board that's appointed by the governor, and our funding comes from a dedicated portion of the corporate business tax. I'm sure many of you remember there was a ballot question to use the corporate business tax to fund open space, farmland, and historic preservation way back in 2014. And at that point, the voters overwhelmingly approved it. Our funding does require legislative support and a final signature by the governor in order to become available. Next slide, please. So today you're going to hear from several of our staff members on how to get started and how to manage your grant. And at this point in time, I'm going to turn this all over to Vito and wish you the best of luck in executing your project.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon at this point, I guess. As Dorothy said, this is a webinar. So just some different features of a webinar as opposed to a normal Zoom call that you might be familiar with is that we do not have view of you, nor can we hear you as attendees of this webinar. Instead, we have access to a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Any questions you have, you can go ahead and type in that Q&A. We will address the Q&A at the end of each section and again at the end of the webinar and answer those questions live or either in chat directly to you. Next slide. So a brief overview of today's agenda. So I'm going to overview the grant agreement process and your grantee info packet and grantee manual materials. And then the rest of our trust staff will discuss how we execute the grant agreement, how we define the scope of work, any archaeological requirements attached to your grant process, how to administer an active grant, the closing out of the grant process, some publicity for your project, and we will later address the Q&A. Next slide, please. So the first step of the grant agreement process is to attend this grantee workshop. You're all here today. Congratulations, you've completed your first step. After today's workshop, we encourage you to submit any supporting documentation, including the grantee info packet, which I'll talk about next. Shortly after that, the trust will assemble those submitted materials and we will send you 2 original copies of a finalized grant agreement for signature. Once you sign that and follow all procedures and send that back to us, we will send it upstairs to the fiscal office here at DCA and the grant agreement will be open and executed. Once the agreement is executed and all signage is in place, the easement is in place if one is required, and all reporting documents are submitted, your agreement is open and active and you'll be able to submit for reimbursement. Next slide, please. So there are 2 primary materials for you as grantees. The first is your grantee info packet, which you should have received in an email from your program officer not too long ago. This document is crucial in executing the grant agreement. We can't do anything until this is all submitted to us and fully complete. Please print, fill out, and compile all certifications and resolutions and mail physical copies to the trust by Friday, March 10th. Carrie will go into some details about the specifics of this info packet shortly. Additionally, we also have the Capital Grant Manual, which is a step-by-step guide outlining the grant agreement process and kind of reiterating what we explained in this workshop today. Go ahead to the next slide, please. This manual is available along with other resources on our webpage. So www.nj.gov/dca/njht is our homepage. On our homepage, there will be a big resources flag at the top of the page, and there is a specific for grantees section. Next slide, please. And on that grantee resources page, there are different breakdowns for capital or HSM grant manuals, and there are subcategories further outlined with PDF documents of everything that you may need access to. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll pass everything off to Carrie. Looks like we do have a quick question, and that we can answer offline. If you'd like to go ahead and take over, Carrie.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie Hogan. I am the Trust's Fiscal Officer. Today, I'll be covering the checklist of documents that is in your grantee packet, which are needed to draft and execute the grant agreement. We need everything on the checklist in order to get things going. So the quicker that you get these documents and forms filled out and handed off to your program officer, the faster your grant agreement can be drafted and executed. The Trust cannot process any reimbursement requests without a fully executed agreement. So the first form in your grantee packet is the checklist. The checklist itself, along with all the items on the checklist, need to be completed and returned to your PO as part of your initial grant agreement package. Please note that the checklist and documents are not your grant agreement. They are simply the essential things that we need to create the grant agreement contract. After the checklist itself, the first item you need to provide is the letter of acceptance. See an example of the checklist there. Letter of acceptance is the second thing in your grantee packet. The second page of the letter of acceptance needs to be filled out completely and signed. By signing the letter of acceptance, you are agreeing to abide by the regulations that govern this grant program, including the requirement to inform your program officer at the Trust of all new developments that pertain to your grant project. Your PO should receive copies of all documentation for review and approval before proceeding with any work. Next slide, please. The next item on your checklist is the information form. This form is critical to creating your grant agreement and needs to be filled out completely and accurately. Number 3 on the information form is your vendor ID number. All grantees must be registered with NJ Start, which is the state's mandatory procurement and payment system, and get a vendor number. Registration in NJ Start creates an account profile for the grantee so that checks can be issued for approved grant reimbursements. Please make sure that you enter your organization's EIN, employee identification number, and a good mailing address to which you will receive your reimbursement checks. The contact person and address that you enter into your NJ Start mandatory profile should match the same name and address on your grant agreement. Incorrect information entered into NJ Start will delay the execution of your grant agreement and possibly delay payments on your award. Please note also that most county and municipal entities are already in the state's vendor system via their EIN number. You've probably been paid one way or another by the state. However, it is best to contact NJ Start directly to confirm that your preferred address and contact information are up to date. Or else, again, your grant reimbursement check could end up just floating around from PO box to PO box at City Hall. For everyone, there is a helpline for getting registered in NJ Start and checking on existing profiles. Please contact the NJ Start help team directly with any NJ Start vendor number questions. You can see that it's up there, and it's also available on our the government website as well. Also, please note that in NJ Start, you will have the option, it's sort of a new feature, you'll have the option to sign up for ACH or automatic payments. These are electronic payments that deposit your grant reimbursement funds directly into your organization's designated bank account. So instead of waiting for a paper check to come in the mail, your approved reimbursement moves automatically to your chosen business account. This can expedite things significantly by up to 3 weeks, I would say. So it's an option for many people. And again, you would have to put that in your NJ Start profile as a preference and then connect your bank information. It sounds really complicated, the NJ Start stuff, but it's not. It doesn't take very long to do to create a profile and get a vendor number. And again, if you do have any hiccups in the process, the helpline for NJ Start really helpful, both by email or directly by phone. Next slide, please. Next on your checklist is proof of insurance. All grantees must maintain insurance coverage for the entire term of the grant agreement and the full term of the easement, if you have one. Grantees must provide a COI, Accord Certificate of Insurance. This is a standard document that insurance companies are very familiar with and can easily provide to you. So get in touch with your insurance company now and let them know that you need one. It's a simple thing you can check off your checklist. Please note that the New Jersey Historic Trust must be named as additionally insured in the lower left box of the accord document. Please also include your project number on the certificate. This way we can match up any subsequent accord certifications to your project file. Grantees must submit a COI accord to the trust before the grant agreement can be executed. Missing or complete information on your accord will delay the process. Next slide, please. Next, we have attachment E, government body board resolution. Your governing body or board needs to pass a resolution certifying the amount of the grant you have been awarded and identifying by name the individual authorized to sign the grant agreement on your organization's behalf. In other words, the person named in attachment E must be the same individual who ultimately signs the final draft of the grant agreement. The resolution must have original signatures of the person approving the resolution, as well as the person attesting to the approval. Approved by and attested by should not be the same person. All resolutions should be certified with a government, corporate, or notary seal or stamp. If your board secretary, for example, does not have an official stamp, you must take your resolution to a notary for certification. In fact, most nonprofits usually they go straight to the notary so that there's no question as to whether or not the approved signature is properly certified. Resolutions that are not properly certified will not be accepted, which will again delay completion of your grant agreement. Please get your resolution on your next board meeting and your next governing body meeting agenda. I know that it can take some time between, usually quarterly board meetings. This is something you're going to want to get on the agenda right away so that you can either call a meeting in time for that March 10th deadline or get it on the meeting agenda. Next slide, please. Next is attachment G, the statement of adequacy of accounting system. Your CFO or treasurer must review the requirements of the grant agreement, including state required audits and reporting, and then sign this form. By signing the form, your financial officer is agreeing to be responsible for establishing and maintaining the financial statements for your grant. Your CFO or treasurer is also the same person that certifies reimbursement requests and signs all payment vouchers. Please note that your CFO treasurer that signs attachment G cannot be the same person authorized by resolution to execute the grant agreement. This provides the necessary checks and balances of healthy accounting, and it's something that we require. And so that we have everything on the checklist. I just wanted to let you know that once you have completed all forms in your grantee packet correctly, you then surface mail it into your program officer directly at the trust so that he or she can prepare the grant agreement. And as Vito mentioned, the next thing that happens once we get everything on the checklist and the checklist itself is that we begin drafting the grant agreement, and that grant agreement will be sent to you for signature and return. You will get 2 copies, sign them both. They need original signatures, original certifications, return both to the trust. Upon return of both signed copies, then Dorothy, our executive director, signs them as well. Then the trust forwards the signed agreements to the Department of Community Affairs Fiscal Services. So there's yet another step. And the Department of Fiscal Services then establishes an account for payment. So then finally, after those steps are complete, one fully executed agreement is mailed to you and one remains on file with the trust office. Make sure you keep your copy of your grant agreement somewhere safe and easily accessible. It is a living document and should be used by the project contact and team as a guide for compliance, reporting, and submitting reimbursement requests. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
No, Carrie, we don't have any questions right now.
That's a miracle. Great. Okay, so next up, my colleague Shannon Bremer will talk about defining a scope of work for your project. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about defining the scope of work for your project. Next slide. So our attachment D1, or our scope of work form, is the component in our grant agreement that establishes the project being funded and the costs associated with each component of the project. All the information in the D1 is based off of the scope of work that each of you submitted last spring when you applied for grant funding. Each program officer will begin drafting the D1s over the coming weeks and sending them to you for review to ensure that we have all the correct information. Once you okay that, and we have your completed info packet, then we can begin formulating your grant agreement. Next slide. So now I'm just going to briefly walk us through every component of the D1, which you can see an example of on the screen here. So the first thing that we list on is all the general information about the grant. So obviously this will include the name of the grantee or who's receiving the funding, your project name, project number, as well as your grant award. The first section of our D1 is then a brief history and statement of significance for the site, as well as a short description of the project being funded. The next section establishes the trust as a primary project review authority and describes the review requirements we have for our grants. If any of you have received a matching grant from another organization outside of the trust, you would also have them listed as well as another review entity. The third section is where we very specifically define the scope of work being funded by this specific grant. So for capital D1s, the scope of work is separated into two components, your non-construction and your construction costs. Non-construction includes all the architectural and engineering services, as well as the bidding documents, and can include other things such as materials testing as well. Then the construction component is broken down by construction division and lists each element of the project scope of work. This breakdown allows both you as the grantee and the trust to clearly see what's included in your scope of work. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the scope of work is broken down by construction division. So we list out every division being covered in your scope of work, as well as the associated work items for each division. The screenshot you see on the slide should look very familiar to everyone. This is the project budget worksheet that each of you submitted with your application. And this is where the staff gets all the information from when we're formulating your D1s for your grant agreement. So none of the costs on this should come as a shock. This is stuff that you submitted to us. There are separate sections for non-construction costs and construction costs. Your non-construction costs cannot exceed 20% of your total project budget. So for example, if your project total is $150,000, your non-construction costs cannot exceed $30,000. We determine your total project budget by adding together your grant award and the minimum match requirement for your grant type. Then we multiply that total project budget by 20% to find the maximum non-construction costs that you can be reimbursed for. The costs for each division are taken from the project budget worksheet, as I mentioned before, as well as any proposals from consultants that you provided with your application. Archaeology costs are considered a construction expense. And this helps to encourage archaeology as an integral part of all of our capital projects where there may be ground disturbing activities. Some language related to archaeology will be added to your D1 scope of work if there is any ground disturbing activities occurring at any time during your project. This is done to make sure that you're aware of all of our archaeological requirements. My colleague Alexis is going to discuss more about those requirements in a little bit. Next slide. So before I go over the final section of the D1 scope of work, I just want to explain another component of our attachment D1, which is the expenditure worksheet. This corresponds with the funded activities listed by construction division in the D1 form. As you can see from the screenshot, it's broken down not only by non-construction and construction costs, but also by construction division. This document is meant to show both your proposed costs as well as any match expended that you included in your application. As a reminder, your match expended can't be added now. It's only costs that you accounted for when you applied. At the bottom of the expenditure spreadsheet, you'll find a running total of your non-construction and construction costs added together, as well as the breakdown showing your grant award, your required match, and your actual match based on the proposed costs that you provided. The ratio section would basically show either a 1-to-1 match for our level 2 grantees or a 3-to-2 match for our level 1 grantees. So when all is said and done, the sheet should be close to, if not identical to, the project budget worksheet you submitted with your application. Just as a heads up, some of the amounts may be adjusted slightly to account for all of our programmatic requirements, such as a temporary project sign, and the permanent plaque, which is only for cost, I believe it's over $50,000 grant amounts. And so don't be alarmed if some of the numbers are slightly off. That those are adjusted by us on purpose. Your non-construction costs also may be adjusted as well if you requested more than the 20% maximum. As with anything else in the D1, if something doesn't make sense or you'd like a further explanation on something in it, please reach out to your program officer and they'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. One final important thing to note is that we do not hold you to the dollar amount for each individual division. These are meant to be a guide for the project. Next slide. The final component of the D1 is the project schedule. These important dates are, these are the important dates associated with your project, including the commencement date of your grant and the expiration date of your grant. I recommend keeping these on hand or posted somewhere you can see them so that you're all aware of all of the deadlines that you have and can plan your grant funded work accordingly, so you're not at risk of having any problems. I'm going to go over the specific dates for our 2022 grant shortly, but for now I just want to talk about the general timeline. So the grant agreement itself must be executed within 18 months of the agreement. All work must begin within 24 months of the agreement commencement date, and all work must be completed within 4 years of the commencement date. And finally, the grant agreement will expire 5 years from the commencement date. So as you can see on the screen, this is the project schedule for our 2022 capital grants. The schedule is based off the day that the governor signed the appropriation bill for the grant, which in this case was December 22nd, 2022. That date is known as the agreement commencement date. For most of you, December 22nd, 2022 will also be considered the work period commencement date. For those that started work prior to this date, we ask that you please provide your program officer with the date you actually began work so it can be reflected in the D1. Otherwise, you may have issues receiving reimbursements for work completed prior to the work period commencement date. From there, we have 18 months to execute the agreement. This is known as the agreement execution date, and that date is June 22nd, 2024. We do recommend that you execute your agreement sooner rather than later, though, since you cannot receive your first reimbursement until the grant agreement is fully executed. You must begin work within the 24-month period following the work period commencement date. And this is your project commencement deadline. For this grant round, that date is December 22nd, 2024. The funded project must then be completed within 4 years of the agreement commencement date, so by December 22nd, 2026. And then the agreement itself expires the 5 years after the agreement commencement date, so on December 22nd, 2027. And this is to allow you an extra year after the work's completed to completely close out your grant. Extensions on these grants are not assumed and are only advised in extenuating circumstances. They must be requested and then approved by our Grants and Loans Committee. So we encourage working closely with your consultant to ensure that you follow these deadlines and dates as closely as possible, since it may be hard to get an extension if your agreement expires. These dates will also appear in your D1 scope of work, so don't worry if you aren't able to copy all of them down right now. In addition to defining the scope of work, we also use the D1 to identify your project team. All consultants working on the grant-funded project must be approved by trust staff and must meet our professional qualification standards. If you included resumes and project proposals from consultants in your original application, they are considered approved unless you have been informed otherwise. If you did not include consultants in your original application, you must submit resumes and project proposals to your program officer to have them approved by the trust before any work can begin. If you're unsure if your project team is appropriate or if they have been approved by trust staff, please contact your program officer and they'll be able to help you out with that. Now, I just want to bring to your attention the trust project requirements for all funded work. All work must meet the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. And this is a part of your program officer's job to review the submitted work to ensure that it meets all the standards. Additionally, archaeology, or at least consideration of archaeology, is required for any project that involves ground disturbance. All projects will be reviewed for archaeological considerations before the D1 is finalized and the grant agreement can be executed. Finally, publicly owned resources may require work authorizations, and this is something that's very project specific. So please reach out to your program officer if you have any questions or concerns, or think that your project does have that requirement, because that's pretty specific to each individual project. The state of New Jersey also has some requirements that our grantees are required to comply with. All of these are laid out in tab 3 of your grant manual. These requirements can be somewhat nuanced and complex, so it's extremely important that your CFO reviews tab 3 of your grant manual in depth to familiarize themselves with the requirements. One of those requirements is the audit requirement. If your organization receives more than $100,000 in state or federal grants in any given fiscal year, you will be required to submit an audit. Even if your New Jersey Historic Trust grant is less than $100,000, your organization may be receiving grants from other federal or state entities in a single fiscal year. If those amounts combined exceed $100,000, you will be required to submit an audit. Audit costs are not reimbursable expenses, so your organization will have to budget for the cost of an audit outside of this project. Our grants also have an affirmative action requirement. Our grantees, their consultants, and contractors are required to comply with the state of New Jersey's affirmative action laws. It's especially important that you have the non-discrimination language and policy in any proposals or contracts related to your grant-funded activities. Your consultants are going to be required to show proof of compliance to the state contract compliance unit through the Department of the Treasury. There are a few ways they can demonstrate this compliance, and more information regarding that can be found in your grant manual. If you have any specific questions regarding affirmative action compliance, they can be directed to the contract compliance unit. The last requirement is prevailing wage, and this is something that only applies to our county and municipal grantees. The only situation that they will apply to our nonprofits is if their site is owned by the county, municipal, or state government. And I see that there are a bunch of questions.
Yes, are you ready for questions, Shannon?
Yeah, we can go ahead and start.
Okay, first one we have is from Sam Stevens. He asked, may we start work on our grant and incur costs to be covered by the grant now?
Yes, is the short answer to that. The only thing is that if you do start now, number one, you have to ensure that your consultant was approved. And if that was submitted with your application, then likelihood is, if you haven't heard otherwise, then you can absolutely go ahead and move forward with them. The only thing is that you will not be able to receive a reimbursement until your grant agreement is fully executed, or if you're required to have an easement, then you would have to have your easement in place before you can receive any funding.
The only thing I'd add to that, Shannon, this is Glenn, is that just make sure your program officer is aware of what's going on. The last thing you want to do is end up doing something that ends up not meeting the Secretary and their standards, and then we won't be able to accept it and reimburse you. So just make sure that if you are starting now, that your program officer is still in the loop.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, the next question we have is from Brandon Nally. He asked, where do we obtain the project expenditure worksheet Excel file?
So that's a great question. I guess the short answer to this would be that this was something that you received or would have had provided to you when you applied for the grant. So that would be located on our website then under the application information. If you're talking about the expenditure worksheet that gets formulated by your program officer with all of your information inputted into it. You should receive those in the coming weeks once all of our program officers start preparing all of the D1s.
Okay, the last question we have is from Hans Sitkus. It's a little project specific, but covers something that probably a lot of grantees would like to know. So his question is, due to construction and material cost increases from over a year ago, there may be some areas in the scope of work that will exceed the grant award and match in. How do we address this? For example, I may have to take out some items because it now exceeds the grant award plus matched raised. Costs are up at least 20%. So basically, if costs are coming in a lot higher than they had expected when they applied for the grant, how is this addressed in the D1?
So this is I'm actually going to pass off to Glenn if he's able to answer this, because he has usually a really good answer to this question.
Okay. It probably depends on the timing of this. Normally we don't work, adjust it into D1 because we're waiting for bids to come in to see what the actual costs are. I don't know if you're sending this project out for a more current cost estimate to then base your bidding documents on that. But typically you're going to be working with your program officer. If it does coming in after bidding or these more current cost estimates come in, you'll work with your program officer to decide what aspects of the grant funded work might be eliminated. But you have to do that in conjunction with your program officer because again, you receive these grants for a specific scope of work. If we're going to adjust that has to come, in negotiations with your program officer and the trust. But it's understood that these are all estimates from a year ago and that prices do change. We're not holding you to each line item. That's basically there to basically come up with the total project cost. But we know that one might come in higher, one might come in lower than what you estimated long ago. So we're willing to work with that. It's not a hard set number. But again, all of this should be done working in conjunction with your program officer.
And to add to that, if you know right out the gate that things are coming in, things are supposed to come in way over the budget you have, that's something we like to take care of when we're reviewing the D1 right away, instead of after the grant agreement is executed. It's just a little bit easier to kind of adjust for things and remove scope items if it becomes absolutely necessary.
Okay, there's one more question here. See, Dennis Bertlin asks, could you please review who is responsible for drafting various project cost spreadsheets?
Yep. So all of the ones that you're going to receive and the ones that I reviewed, those come from the trust. So trust staff will prepare all of these. Let me see if I can. Hopefully this is a little better. So all of the worksheets are prepared by trust staff, and then those are distributed to you once those are prepared. That project expenditure worksheet or the project budget worksheet that we mentioned earlier, that was something that you had prepared or your consultant had prepared and submitted with your application last spring.
Okay, that looks like that's all the questions we have for now.
I'm going to pass it off to Alexis.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alexis Alamy, and I'm going to give you a very brief refresher of the archaeological requirements for receiving grant funding through the trust, since we haven't met yet, and you haven't talked about archaeology since your applicant workshop. So as a reminder, even if the primary goal of your project is not an archaeological investigation, you must consider archaeology if you have any ground disturbing activities planned. Examples of the kinds of activities necessitating the consideration of archaeology may include, but are not limited to, Projects that include the installation of buried utility lines, site grading related to the construction or expansion of parking lots and sidewalks, construction of ADA compliant improvements such as ramps, removal and installation of footings, installation of HVAC systems, and foundation work. Often, activities performed in advance of those I just stated may also cause ground disturbance, such as soil testing or the staging of construction vehicles and materials, which through their sheer weight, size, and movement might cause ground disturbance of their own. Even when choosing a location for your mandatory NJHT project sign, you'll need to keep the potential impact to a potential archaeological resource in mind. At this point in the process, you should have already considered archaeology if needed and have hopefully accounted for addressing this need in your scope of work. Your next step toward fulfilling the archaeological requirements for your project should be to select a qualified professional archaeologist and involve them in your project early so they can help ensure that any archaeological resources on your site are either avoided or excavated as appropriate. A qualified archaeologist is a professional in the field who meets the professional qualification standards of the Secretary of the Interior. Keep in mind that archaeological testing will need to occur before any ground disturbance, including those that I had mentioned in the previous slide. It's a good idea to handle the archaeological component of your project early in case any activities requiring ground disturbance need to occur that you hadn't considered, such as soil testing in advance of the real focus of your project, or in case something is discovered archaeologically that might necessitate some alterations to your plans. I'd also like to note at this point that archaeological monitoring is not considered best practice and may be employed only in select circumstances. The decision to utilize monitoring as your archaeological approach must be made by a qualified professional archaeologist. Once the archaeologist you're working with has completed their part of the work, they will prepare a report of their findings for you. This report must be submitted to your program officer and will be reviewed by the trust. But all that said, every project is going to be different and there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to archaeology. So just make sure that your project team is on the same page and keep the trust in the loop so we can all work together to bring your project to completion while preserving the archaeological resources on your site at the same time. While the scientific value of what you might uncover archaeologically is invaluable on its own, archaeology also has the added benefit of being incredibly interesting to most people. Taking the opportunity to share the archaeology on your property with the people who visit and love it serves as an excellent avenue for increasing public engagement at your site. We've seen a number of successful public archaeology projects here at the Trust, including at the William Trent House, where they often invite the public to not only observe the archaeology taking place on site, but also to participate in it. Depending on the scope of the archaeological investigation you'll be undertaking, archaeology can be used as a training opportunity as well, allowing for collaboration with local professional archaeologists and universities to build mutually beneficial partnerships that might broaden your network, as well as serve the next generation of archaeologists by offering them excavation experience. And on top of all of these wonderful benefits, archaeology can give new insight to your site and add to your understanding of its use and development over time, as well as provide you with some lovely artifacts to display and interpret from your own grounds. All of this and more could be yours when you use the archaeological requirements of your property as a tool for increasing public engagement. And before I pass things off to Glenn, are there any questions?
We have one request, just to please define archaeology monitoring.
Sure. Archaeological monitoring is observation of excavation by a non-archaeologist by an archaeologist. This often happens in construction settings where large trenches are being excavated mechanically and supervised by an archaeologist to ensure that anything of potential sensitivity is being properly documented or construction being halted if necessary.
Great. That's all the questions we have for now.
All right, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Glenn Saponis. I'm going to be talking about administering an active grant. This is chapter 4. Again, we referenced that all of this is in your grant manual. So this is chapter 4 in the grant manual. And everything I'm about to cover is detailed there, including examples of pre-qualification forms and how to report stuff, as well as reimbursement forms. So that's chapter 4 of your grant agreement. All right, next slide, please. So we encourage you to communicate with the trust throughout your open grant process, everything from submitting your documentation now to when we're actually or underway with construction, etc. So prior to construction, oftentimes you'll typically reach out to the trust when you have planning dockets to be reviewed by us, construction drawings or specifications, the pre-qualification of contractors, as well as the contractor pre-qualification forms submitted by the contractors themselves. I mean, we work with you to come up with the criteria as well as review the stuff submitted by the contractors. Also, typically you'll reach out to us when your bids come in. We'll review that. During construction, we typically are in contact with you, again, receiving all meeting notices. We want to be at meetings if we can. We should also be receiving all meeting minutes. And again, remember that the grantee is responsible for communication. So invite us to project meetings. We might not be able to attend all of the meetings, but at least that way we could plan to be there if there's mock-ups to be reviewed by us, or if there's other things that need us on site to review. If it's important and we're needed there, we'll make the we'll be there for that. Again, let us know communication-wise if you're proposing any changes to proposed scope of work or consultants. Again, you need to communicate that with us before the changes are made to make sure that, again, it meets the requirements of the grant agreement as well as the Secretary of Interior standards. Also, if you have not selected a consultant yet, we do need to review those qualifications for the consultant. Again, if you're using the same consultant that was in your application, then basically we're approving it at that point in time. But if that has changed, you need to have us review the qualifications of the consultant before they're brought on board. Next, please. You'll also be communicating with the trust through quarterly reports. Reports are due basically mid-April, mid-July, mid-October, and mid-January. This is the C1 report in your grant agreement. It includes a narrative, a team list, project schedule, various submissions, and basically you'll be certifying that everything included is accurate and up to date. Depending on your particular project, the narrative section may be a paragraph or two, or maybe longer. Again, depends on what activity has been taking place. These items especially are important in your first report, because once you submit your first report, then you can basically use that as kind of your baseline and basically add to it as future reports are produced. Rather than reinventing the wheel, you could basically just make changes or updates to your subsequent reporting. Reports other than the reimbursement requests consists of basically the first 2 pages of that C1 form. That's basically just, again, the narrative, the schedule. The manual shows, again, in detail how to complete the quarterly report. Next, please. The other pages of your quarterly report is basically based on the reimbursement requests. Now, keep in mind that before we can provide a reimbursement, we need the following. We need the executed grant agreement, as was mentioned. We need the project sign installed, and I'll talk about the signage in a little bit, as well as a recorded easement, if applicable. And applicable, I'll talk about easements as well, but basically it's nonprofit. Properties that are owned by nonprofits will likely require an easement or an amendment to an easement if you already have one with us. So again, each reimbursement is going to require necessary documentation, including invoices and proof of payments. Proof of payments could include canceled checks, bank statements. It could be a fully executed purchase order if you're a municipality or agency of a county. During construction, requests should include any additional documentation that may not have been submitted, such as meeting minutes, progress photos, change orders. All these should be part of the reimbursement request or progress report. For reimbursement, we also need a state payment voucher, which again is included in your grant agreement. This requires original signatures of your CFO or treasurer. That attachment G of the info packet that Carrie spoke about earlier, that's who will be signing your payment vouchers and your certificates for your reimbursements. Again, payment takes approximately 3 weeks after we have everything in hand. And again, as Carrie mentioned, if you're able to register for direct deposits through ACH, that will expedite those payments as well. Keep in mind, especially if you've gotten a planning grant from us in the past, keep in mind that with the construction grants, these are pure reimbursement grants. And it's either a 60-40 or 50-50 matching grant, which means that when you submit a reimbursement request, you'll be receiving a reimbursement of either 60% or 50% of that amount spent, minus 5% of our portion, which we hold as retainage until we close out the grant. Once all the completion of materials are submitted, we'll provide that 5% retainage back to you. Just to break it down a little bit more, a level 1 grant, which is $150,000 or less, basically what you're doing is multiplying by 0.57 of the total spent in that quarter or period, and that's the amount of the reimbursement you're getting. So just so you're not surprised that you submitted a request for $100,000 and you only got 50,000 or 49, without our 5%, because that accounting for both our portion as well as your match portion. So that's where that multiplier comes from. For a level 2 grant, which is $150,000 up to $750,000, the multiplier is 0.475. Again, this from a cash flow standpoint, this is important, especially to our nonprofits, just so you understand how much you're getting back with each reimbursement request ahead of time, basically. And ultimately what you're doing is you're showing us invoices and payments for the entire project cost, not just our share, but both our share and your match. So it's the total project cost that you're demonstrating through invoices and proofs of payment. Again, for capital grants, you can submit reimbursements quarterly with your normal quarterly report, or especially if it's a cash flow issue, you could do it on a monthly basis, depending on how you're paying your contractors. But you can work with your program officer to determine what schedule works best for you, and what's needed from your cash flow standpoint. Next, please. The next thing I want to touch on is work product review. Typically for capital grants, this is primarily documents submitted for like construction documents, plans, specifications, that sort of thing. But we will review the stuff prior to construction, and if things change, we'll be reviewing this stuff during construction as well. All work products must meet the Secretary standards for the treatment of historic properties, and the trust needs to approve documents prior to the start of construction. So we should be approving, again, if there's any changes, if during construction your contractor recommends, oh, I think we should be doing this way instead of what's on the plans, you need to work with both your architect and the trust to make sure that those are acceptable, that those do meet the standard. So just because it was suggested during construction, again, we need trust review and approval before moving forward with that. If any of your projects include ground disturbing activities, as Alexis mentioned, that archaeology does need to be considered. And again, the sooner the better, just to make sure that, again, we're not stopping construction, because time is money. Bid packages and qualification documents also need to be reviewed by the trust. And I'll go into this in more detail shortly. Next, please. Capital grants typically require 2 grant-related signs. The construction sign must be installed prior to receiving a reimbursement, and that needs to remain in place basically throughout the whole construction project. We provide basically specifications for the size. We give our logo templates. All that is available on our website under the what Vito mentioned as far as the grantee resources section of our website. But all the specifications are there, everything from color choices to the size of the sign and placement. Construction grants over $50,000 also required installation of a permanent plaque prior to closing out the grant. This is an eligible expense, and consider its design and manufacture early in the process so that it doesn't delay your closing out the grant, because we can't close out until we actually see a photo of the sign in place. The sign could be your standard bronze plaque, but we also encourage you can satisfy the requirement by basically including the language into a more broadly interpretive sign that you might place on your property. Next, please. Again, with capital grants, easements may be a requirement. Again, these are for nonprofit own properties with grants of over $50,000 will require a term easement be placed on the property, on the property. And the easement is a deed that runs with the land, and the length of the easement is dependent upon the size of the grant. As you can see in the slide, that from 50,000 up to 100,000, it's a 15-year easement. Over 100,000 to 450, it's 20, and if it's over 450 up to 750, it's a 30-year easement. And the easement basically covers the work that's being done on the property. It's basically the state's investment in your property is being protected for that time period. Keep in mind too that the grantee is responsible for the costs of recording the easement. It's not a reimbursable expense, and typically these are, I want to say, could be up to 30-page documents, and typically run between $200 and $300 is what we've seen, depending on the individual county as far as what they're charging. But anyway, the easement does ensure that the resource is being protected for the stipulated time because of the state funds. And also during the easement period, that any project you propose that may affect the stuff being protected by the easement, again, the stuff that we've paid for already, needs to be reviewed by the Historic Trust to make sure, again, that is meeting the Secretary of Interior standards as well. You will be required to, again, once the project is over and you're under easement, you'll be required to submit a brief annual easement report once a year, basically, and maintain the liability insurance on the property as well. Next, I want to briefly talk about contractors and bidding. The trust requires that pre-qualification of contractors for the trust, for all trust-funded projects. Pre-qual regulations help to ensure that they're qualified and experienced contractors are working on your project, and only contractors that are pre-qualified will be allowed to bid on your project. One thing to keep in mind, and this is something that we've recently found out through local government services, is that we can't pre-qualify subcontractors. Only general contractors can be pre-qualified in this process. But what we strongly suggest is the language in your bid documents, basically, put your general contractors on notice that they are responsible for any of the subs working under them for the quality of their work. There are sample regulations and sample bidder qualifications in the manual, the grantee manual, again, chapter 4. You and often your consultant will work with your program officer in developing the criteria tailored to your project. Municipal and county government agencies will develop the same type of criteria, but they will follow kind of specific procedures for pre-qualifying contractors. And this includes advertising, holding a governing body meeting to adopt the criteria that we've developed. The process also includes review by the State Division of Local Government Services. Be sure to provide enough time for this process. The public meeting needs to be advertised 20 days in advance of the meeting, and Division of Local Government Services needs to review how that meeting was held. So there's documents that need to be submitted to them after the fact. But Local Government Services is very good about working with you and us as far as reviewing the material ahead of time to make sure that that's going to be all in order for when you do hold your public hearing. All construction contracts also in excess of $100,000 must be publicly advertised. The trust encourages public advertising with the goal of receiving as many bids as possible and trying to keep those costs down. And while you can solicit pre-qual packages directly from contractors, you also have to publicly advertise for those potential contractors through 1 or 2 local newspapers. Always keeping in mind that since we are pre-qualifying contractors, that the lowest responsive bid will be selected, since they should all be qualified contractors. Next, please. There are certain times when a grant agreement needs to be amended. If a project is not on track, the grant agreement can be amended to allow you an opportunity to complete the project. If there's a change to the schedule for any reason, a change to the scope of work, or a change to the consultant or contractor, you must request that the grant agreement be amended. And you should be working with, and again, working with your program officer throughout this process. I mean, so there's, there shouldn't be any surprise to this. I mean, we could see how things are going along. And again, if they're aware of what's going on, it might make that change easier in the long term. Again, this request is attachment D2 in your grant agreement. and simply requires you to basically explain the reason for the change or delay. The request will be reviewed by our Grants and Loans Committee at its quarterly meeting, and you'll be informed if the change has been accepted. Again, there are also times when delays are caused by circumstances beyond your control. To the fullest extent possible, however, you should make sure that your project stays on schedule, because getting an extension is not always guaranteed. The Trust Grants and Loans Committee will not automatically just grant the extension. It will have to be fully justified. And again, remember too that your grant management history is part of your grant application evaluations. So you want to make sure that you do your best to keep on schedule if at all possible. All right, and finally, we're going to go over closing out the grant.
Glenn, we have a couple questions. Do you want to take them before you move on to this section?
Sure.
Okay. So the first one we have is from Lynn Laffey. She asked, what happens if no contractors submit qualifications during the pre-qualification process?
We have to try to, basically expand your pool. I mean, because we need, we have to try it again. Just like if no one bids on something, we have to then look and see why and then put it out to bid again. But typically what I see with most of our capital grants is, you'll work with your consultant and you'll send out basically the pre-qual forms to perhaps a number of contractors that have worked on with your consultant in the past, but also, again, if it's large enough, we also want you to advertise too. So hopefully the combination of advertising as well as sending out, that you will get at least a handful of people submitting pre-qualifications. We have seen recently that there's a lot of contractors who are very busy right now, and some just choose not to, and that's been delaying some projects because there just have not been contractors available.
Okay. Our next question is, if our site is visible to the public from 3 sides, are we able to choose where the mandatory sign is placed?
We'll work with your program officer. I mean, we want the sign to be visible by the public so they understand where the funding is coming from, that's their tax dollars, hard at work, and they understand that. So the main thing is that it's visible to the general public who's passing by. And again, we could work with the program officer for if there's a specific location that you're looking at. Again, we're also taking into consideration potential archaeological concerns and that sort of thing too. So that might play a role in where the sign's placed.
Okay. Another question is, the grant is to a nonprofit, but the site is owned by a municipality. Do we still need an easement?
Nope, because it falls under the New Jersey Register Act, which requires that any buildings owned by, any listed buildings owned by agency of government needs to be reviewed and get project authorization through the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office. So, so there's not a duplication of effort. We do not require an easement if the building is owned by an agency of government.
Okay, and this question comes from Wayne McCabe. He asked, if we have to go out to the public to get interested bidders, how do we assure they have been pre-qualified?
Actually, the first step is actually to have the contractors answer a qualification questionnaire, basically, which you, the consultant, your consultant, and the trust work together to develop that criteria and that basic questionnaire that you will send out to contractors to have them complete. Once they complete that, they submit it back to you and the trust. We review that, determine who has met the criteria that was established, and those are the contractors then that are qualified or pre-qualified to then bid on your project.
Okay, that's all the questions we have for now. Thank you.
So there's one more about only one bidder. Can they make an award?
Okay, I was gonna type an answer, but go ahead if you want to answer it.
All right. I mean, if you advertised and you put it out and you've gotten, I mean, again, we're hoping for more than one bidder just because it betters your chances of getting the best price. But if at the end of the day, if you've gone through the whole process, you've done your best to solicit multiple bids and get multiple contractors in order, if only one chooses to bid, again, you don't have to, if it's way out of whack with the estimates and stuff like that, You don't have to actually accept it. At that point in time, you might have to go back and look at your scope of work, look to see why it's way out of whack with what your estimates were. But again, we'll deal with that, I guess, when or if that happens, I guess. But if it's within budget and stuff like that, and they've been qualified, then yes, you would accept that one bid.
Okay, that's all for you for
Okay.
now. Thank you.
All right, sure. So go back to closing out the grant. So you've done a great job up to this point. I mean, you've submitted your quarterly reports. You've been reimbursed for everything, and everything has been going great. It even came in under budget. Don't laugh, because actually I had a project last year that actually did come in substantially under budget. So it is possible. I hope I'm not jinxing anyone. I just knocked on wood. Next slide, please. So closing out the grant. The final report is your attachment C2 of your grant agreement. That's both your final report as well as your final reimbursement request. The final narrative and pictorial report, as appropriate, you'll submit at this time, as well as all finalized financial documentation. If you've submitted all invoices and canceled checks up to this point, it's just the retainage, then it's meeting these other requirements and you'll get your 5% retainage. If you can include as your final reimbursement request money spent since your last request, and include that as part of your closeout material as well, we could combine those two. But remember too that you'll have to, with all of these reimbursement requests, you're going to have to submit new payment vouchers with your CFO's original signature on it. Instructions and itemized checklist can be found as part of your C2 section in your grant agreement. This is covered again, Chapter 4 of your grant manual, and I'll go over the specifics real shortly here. Once all the elements of the final reimbursement report and request have been accepted and approved, you'll receive the remaining 5% retainage of your grant award. Next, please. So the final report must include the following, again, a narrative to explain how the project went, basically. You'll be submitting before and after photographs, a photograph of the permanent plaque installed. That's why I said it's important to actually talk about that with your consultant and or your contractor early, so that, likely they might be installing it for you. Employment figures from your consultant and your contractors. They'll provide to you how many tradespeople have been working on the project, as well as how many professionals have been working on the project. We'll ask at this point too if there's any revised scope of work, if anything had to be adjusted based on, stuff that you had not figured on that were uncovered during work, or if, again, because of cost overruns, perhaps we had to limit part of the scope. So at this point in time, we'll also be revising that. You'll give us the final total project cost. You'll give us as-built drawings. So again, you'll be working with your contractor early on, make sure they're aware that they're going to have to be providing as-built drawings to the trust. For those of you who have not done a construction project before, basically it's the construction drawings that the contractor keeps on site and marks up any changes that they're making to those approved plans. And we need those as a part of your closeout documents. Also, we ask for a closeout letter from your consultant, basically certifying that the scope of work and the project is complete. Again, keep in mind that some of these items are being collected throughout the project, photos, again, the as-built drawings, all that. So make sure your contractor's aware of these, so that he's not trying to find them at the end of the project, that he's putting them aside, photos and other things as you go along. And once the final report and reimbursement requests have been approved by your program officer at the trust, your final payment will be processed and your grant will be closed. Next, please. Real briefly, multi-phase projects. We only have one under this grant round. Actually, you're looking at it. It's the Walt Whitman complex in Camden. But basically, all subsequent capital phases are contingent upon the completion or substantial completion of a current capital phase. And work with your PO so we know when that's approaching, so that we can make sure that the next tranche of funding gets passed and signed with the next appropriation bill. But we will have to execute a new grant agreement for the next proposed phase of work. So again, just make sure that you're working with your program officer so that we can keep up with that and make sure that all this stuff is in the pipeline when need be. All right, that's all I have. There are no questions. He speaks too soon. Oh, you're welcome, Mark. But that's all I have. So I'm going to turn it over to Ashley Parker, who will talk about publicizing your project.
All right, so many of you are still tuned in, so I wanted to begin by saying thank you for hanging in there. You've received a lot of information this afternoon, but we're in the home stretch now. So once again, my name is Ashley Parker. I am the Historic Preservation Specialist for Heritage Tourism and the Communication Coordinator here at the Trust. So today I will go over how publicity can play an important role in your project. Publicity can help maintain visibility of your project and your organization during the preservation campaign. It can increase attendance and/or membership for programs and activities, and can also attract new funding support and additional resources. Publicizing your project also promotes and raises awareness of history and historic preservation in New Jersey. So this helps ensure ongoing funding for historic preservation. Good publicity opportunities are grant award announcements and check presentations, project milestones such as groundbreaking or ribbon cutting ceremonies, tours, special events, or profiles on volunteers, staff, or special craftsmen, and public archaeology. You may also send letters to your legislatures and representatives. These opportunities can be achieved by news or journal articles about your project, social media posts, or special televised news coverage. If you are interested in coordinating a check presentation or a grant award announcement, please contact your program officer. We have a large check for presentation that looks great in photos, and we are very eager to use it. Additionally, your site might also be eligible for inclusion on Journey Through Jersey, the state's go-to website for all things heritage tourism that was launched by the Trust in 2017. The website features heritage tourism destinations throughout the state in addition to annual events, educational resources, blog posts, and travel itineraries, which are featured on Journey Through Jersey's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We also host unique educational opportunities for Journey Through Jersey site managers. 10 Journey Through Jersey participants received complimentary registration to the Travel and Tourism Conference in 2022. We highly encourage you to nominate your visitor-ready site. Journey Through Jersey will publicize your resource for free. You will receive a welcome packet upon joining that will include a window decal and postcard with a QR code that links visitors to the Journey Through Jersey website. The only thing we ask in return is, if you are a participating resource, that you include the Journey Through Jersey logo with a link to the website on your organization's homepage. If you would like to learn more about Journey Through Jersey, would like to be featured, or are interested in writing a blog post, please contact me directly. My contact information can be found at the end of this presentation and on the Trust website. So help us help you promote your project by staying in touch with us. The Trust is active on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We encourage you to tag us in posts, send us news coverage, progress photos, events, or any other content that you would like us to share. There are no guarantees, but we will try to post as much as we can. We kindly ask that you reshare our posts and link to our website in order to help us raise awareness about funding opportunities and historic preservation in New Jersey. So at this time, I'd like to turn the presentation back over to my colleague, Judy, to address any additional questions that you might have.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any more questions.
Well, I'd say a job well done then. No more questions. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we have a large number of people who hung in for the entire presentation, so thank you for that as well. And you can always email your program manager if you have any questions or think of anything, and as we mentioned at the beginning, this presentation's been recorded and will be available sometime next week if you want to go over any of the facets of this. So thank you very much and good luck with your projects.
Thank you, everyone.